Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Silent Film, A Very Short Introduction by Donna Kornhaber, narrated by Emily Beresford. Introduction. All film is silent film. Think about the last time you went to the movies. Whatever film you saw, it probably seems like it has little connection to cinema's silent era, which ran from the invention of film recording and projection technology around 1895 until the worldwide introduction of synchronized sound in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The film you saw undoubtedly had spoken dialogue and sound effects. It was not silent at all. It probably had a swelling score. It was almost certainly in color. What relation could that film possibly have to the bygone era of silent pictures? That seemingly primordial cinematic age encapsulated in the idea of a black-and-white film dimly flickering on a screen, while a lonely musician idly plays piano in the corner. No matter what you watched, the film you saw probably owes more to the silent era than you realize. More than likely, the film told a story of some kind. And it did so not just by advancing its narrative through dialogue, but also by constructing patterns of interconnected imagery that helped you to understand that story, adding layers of emotional and thematic depth in the process. It featured close-ups and long shots, pans and zooms, and a tracking shot perhaps. It probably had a movie star attached to it, which may have made you want to see it. Or maybe it was the name of the director that interested you, understanding the director as a figure who plays a pivotal role in shaping a film. Maybe you saw a big-budget Hollywood spectacle with extensive special effects. Maybe it was an independent film, or a film from a foreign country. Maybe it was a genre picture, a western or a horror movie or a sci-fi flick. Or maybe it was an animated film, a documentary, or an avant-garde work that defies categorization. If you went out to the movies, you almost certainly watched that film in a purpose-built theater. Maybe it was a nondescript theater down the street, or maybe it was one of those special luxury cinemas with fancy leather recliners and red carpet service. Or maybe you stayed home and streamed a movie on your computer or television. Maybe it was an older movie from a couple of years ago that everyone else had already seen, available at a discount. Or maybe you subscribed to a streaming service and you watched the latest big thing, the movie everyone is talking about, produced by that streaming service and available only on its platform. If any of these conditions was true for you, then the movie you watched owes something to the era of silent film. It probably owes a great deal to it. Nearly every major aspect of how films are made, how they tell their stories, even the fact that they tell stories, and how they are exhibited, originates in the innovations, experiments, and consolidations that marked the 3 decades of silent film, which were among the most fecund periods in the history of motion pictures. Yes, a lot has changed since then, but not as much as you might think. Even sound originates in the silent era, not just in the adoption of synchronized sound technology at the era's end, but also in the experiments with sound effects, dialogue, and narration that were part of film exhibition almost from the beginning. The same goes for the musical score, and even for color film, with numerous approaches to colorization being part of the period's experimentation. Film as we know it exists because of the accidents, decisions, and strategies that defined the silent era. The most important of these is the fact of silence itself. This single technological limitation, the fact that early film technology could not initially support synchronized sound, instigated years of experimentation as filmmakers tried to meet a growing demand for narrative with films that were intelligible and appealing. Had sound been part of the birth of film, as it was with television, the history of cinema might have unfolded differently, and film itself might look unrecognizable. It took decades for television to acquire the visual sophistication that had long defined the cinema, and it did so largely through importing the techniques and technicians of the film industry. The reasons for these media differences are manifold, but a major factor is the simple fact that television always had recourse to sound, while film did not. Insofar as film is a visual medium, one wherein imagery predominates over sound, That status is a result of the 3 decades filmmakers spent refining the medium's visual apparatus to accommodate the absence of sound. In a sense, all film is silent film, insofar as the very substance of what it means to make a film first came into being in the silent era. This is not to say that silent film's only measure of importance lies in what it bequeathed to later cinema. Equally significant are the practices that existed only in those early years. One of the great mistakes of film scholarship for many years was its propensity to see the silent era only as a birthing ground for sound-era film technique, an essentially evolutionary view that rendered the period inherently primitive. In fact, the silent era was a period of great sophistication, both in the artistry of its films and in the ingenuity of the systems devised for making, distributing, and displaying those films. The legacy of those films and of those systems is one proof of the period's continuing relevance. Yet, even those aspects of the silent era that seem most remote from us in the 21st century have much to teach us historically, and much to reveal to us artistically. Numerous silent films remain among the most iconic the medium has ever produced. Just mention the rocket hitting the eye of the man in the moon from George Méliès's A Trip to the Moon, about a fantastical turn-of-the-century journey into outer space, or the terrifying robot from Fritz Lang's Metropolis, about a workers' revolt in a dystopian city of the future, and film buffs will instantly call the images to mind. Some of the period's greatest stars remain household names more than a century after they rose to fame, as the ongoing popularity of Charlie Chaplin or the enduring image of Greta Garbo attests. And many of the cinema's most revered filmmakers owe their careers in part or in whole to the silent era. From John Ford to Cecil B. DeMille to Alfred Hitchcock, to name just a few. Even the silent era's profound differences from later cinema can prove illuminating. In an age when Hollywood movies dominate the world box office, it is important to remember a moment when the United States did not initially rank among the world's top film producers. From Europe to Asia and beyond, the story of silent film is truly global. And it is also a far more diverse tale than many might assume. In Hollywood and elsewhere, women played an outsized role in the development of silent film as an industry and an art. As directors, producers, screenwriters, editors, and in many other capacities, all at numbers that would stagger a modern studio executive. Even for those kept out of such positions on the basis of ethnicity or race, the film medium itself offered a chance to tell stories that might not otherwise be told, and bring into focus images that the mainstream culture was at pains to ignore. This is also a vital part of the history of silent film, and the work of such female filmmakers as Alice Guy Blaché and Lois Weber, Asian-American entrepreneurs such as Marion Wong, or the African-American director Oscar Micheaux, are as important to that story as anything by D.W. Griffith or Cecil B. DeMille. In its landmark achievements and its forgotten innovations, the legacy of silent film remains with us still. It is part of nearly every movie that we watch. The story of silent film is one of motion picture history's greatest tales, a story with global reach and an expansive cast of characters. This book offers an overview of that story, both in its distant past and in the ways in which its legacy is still unfolding. Chapter 1. The 3 Ages of Silent Film. In 1923, comedian Buster Keaton released 3 Ages, his first feature film as co-director and star. Conceived as a parody of D.W. Griffith's 1916 epic, Intolerance, which cut across 3 wildly different timelines, ancient Babylon, Renaissance France, and the United States of the Progressive Era, to explore love's struggle throughout the ages, Keaton's 3 Ages applied the same time-skipping structure to deliberately less than epic effect. Equally hapless as a caveman, an ancient Roman, and a modern man about town, Keaton's character struggles to win the heart of his love interest, no matter what the epoch. Part of the joke is just how little the story changes even as the centuries pass. Whether he is contending against dinosaurs, chariot races, or automobiles, Keaton is consistently stymied. Yet the decision to cut the film's narrative in 3 was also a shrewd business move. Keaton had until that point starred only in shorts, and did not yet know whether he would be successful in a longer picture. If the film flopped, he could easily cut it into 3 and release each part as a separate comic short. The 3 films within the film were thus connected, and also entirely separate from one another. Keaton's ingenious narrative structure offers a helpful framework for understanding the history of silent film. Although it is common to speak of the silent era as though it were a unified period, this is far from true. For film historians, the silent era is composed of at least 3 separate periods, each with its own filmmaking norms and unique industrial structures. Roughly speaking, they consist of the periods of early cinema, running from the invention of motion picture recording and projection technology around 1895 to the middle of the next decade, when film was primarily a technological attraction. A transitional period encompassing the later aughts and much of the 1910s, when filmmakers started to experiment with new narrative techniques and the modern studio first emerged, and the classical period that began toward the end of the First World War, when earlier formal experiments were consolidated into the classical style of filmmaking promoted by the ascendant Hollywood studios. Even this subdivision is a simplification. Some scholars divide the silent era even further, and there are ongoing disagreements regarding the dating of major transitions. But Keaton's framework of the 3 ages offers a useful way to begin to understand these complexities. Each of these ages is part of the same overarching story, that of filmmakers' ongoing attempts to harness the motion picture camera as a tool of entertainment and of art in the absence of synchronized sound. And each age is also severable from the others, marked by its own creative goals and industrial conditions. Together, they tell the story of silent film writ large, but each one has its own discrete storyline. The story of silent film is ultimately not one story, but 3. Early cinema. The history of cinema begins with an invention repeated 3 times. In 1895, the German brothers Max and Emil Skladanowski appeared at Berlin's Wintergarten Theater to demonstrate their new bioscope, a machine capable of projecting movie pictures. 1 month later, another pair of brothers, Louis and Auguste Lumière in France, demonstrated their competing device, the cinematograph, at a screening at the Grand Café in Paris. Though the Skladanowskis can lay claim to the first successful film projection, the Lumières were the ones to popularize the technology. Within months of the Paris screening, they had sent representatives around the world to exhibit their new apparatus, laying the foundations for the soon dominant French film industry, and conclusively demonstrating the worldwide appeal of the fledgling cinematic medium. Yet, it was the 3rd iteration of the invention that proved the most fateful. This time, the technology appeared in the United States via the Edison Manufacturing Company. Thomas Edison, the famed innovator behind the light bulb and the phonograph, had preceded the Europeans with the 1894 release of the kinetoscope, a device developed by his employee, William Dixon, that allowed for the hand-cranked, individual viewing of motion pictures. Audiences clamored for the large-scale projection of the bioscope and cinematograph. Edison responded with the Vitascope, which would soon rival the cinematograph as the era's leading motion picture technology. But Edison's main innovation in motion pictures was more artistic than technological. The Lumières were convinced the appeal of motion pictures would be short-lived, and thus they focused primarily on selling the cinematograph itself. By 1905, they left the film industry entirely to pursue work in developing color photography. Edison, in contrast, believed in the entertainment potential of the medium, and in 1894 established a dedicated motion picture department within the Edison Manufacturing Company, which eventually grew into one of the most important film studios of the silent era. Other production companies followed suit, and the motion picture industry was born. This early version of the industry looked nothing like what we know in the 21st century, either in its industrial structure or in the films it made. Movie studios in the modern sense did not emerge for another 2 decades, and the earliest film companies, notably Edison and its leading French competitor, Pathé Frères, founded in 1896, initially made much of their money from sales and licensing of their recording and projection technology, creating films primarily as a means to foster the spread of such equipment. The earliest films tended to be short and visually simple, running only a few minutes long, sometimes even just a few seconds, and featuring a straightforward recording of someone or something placed before the camera. Other producers without a stake in equipment sales soon emerged, but the focus on brief and modest films persisted. To modern viewers, these films can seem like curious specimens with little entertainment appeal. Of the 10 films shown at the Grand Café, all were under a minute in length. Most displayed simple scenes from life, with the camera placed at a fixed distance from the subjects recorded. The best known is workers leaving the Lumière factory, taken outside the gates of the very factory where the cinematograph was made. Others include Baby's Meal, in which Auguste Lumière and his wife feed their infant daughter, and The Sea, in which bathers take turns diving off a jetty. Only one of the films approaches a condition of storytelling, a short called The Sprinkler Sprinkled, in which a mischievous boy puts his foot on a garden hose and then releases it when a gardener holds the hose to his eye to investigate. These modest films from the Grand Café presage much of the cinema's first decade. Even as the first companies dedicated to producing films developed, the focus on recording scenes from life remained. Some proved quite exotic, as in the later Lumière film Panorama of the Grand Canal, in which the cinematograph was placed inside a Venetian gondola, creating the first instance of a moving camera. But others were surprisingly mundane. Among the most popular films of the period were Rough Sea at Dover, by the British pioneer Burt Akers, showing waves in the English Channel, or the later Lumière film, The Arrival of a Train, capturing a few moments at the railroad station La Ciotat. Accounts that the film's first audience fled the screen thinking the train was real are purely apocryphal. Even as other types of films developed during this period, they still tended to emphasize the unadorned recording of unfolding action. Edison focused initially on filming vaudeville performers, and even at one point staged a boxing match inside its studio. Others, such as the American Vitagraph Company, focused on filming or recreating news events in films known as topicals, while some companies recorded stage productions, with religious pageants proving especially popular. The most technically advanced films of the period were those that focused on tricks of the camera, using techniques of editing to make people seem to suddenly appear or disappear on screen, or to make inanimate objects appear to move on their own, as if haunted. The French filmmaker Georges Méliès, a successful stage magician, specialized in such films, as did the Anglo-American director J. Stuart Blackton, one of the founders of Vitagraph. Story films that told a fictional narrative over multiple scenes emerged during this period as well, but remained generally austere in their construction. Though they might include a dozen or more scenes cut together through editing, as with Edison director Edwin Porter's The Great Train Robbery, which depicted a daring Western heist and ran to 14 scenes. Each scene played out in full at a fixed distance from the camera, running from start to finish like a scene in a play before the next scene would begin. At their longest, such films never lasted more than about 15 minutes, using no more than a single reel of film. Isolated examples of cinematographic devices, such as close-ups and camera movements, abound in this era. The British filmmaker George Albert Smith was already using combinations of medium shots and close-ups in his films from the turn of the century. For example, in The Sick Kitten, where the film cuts from a medium shot of a girl feeding a kitten to a close-up of the pet sipping a spoonful of milk. The Great Train Robbery itself includes a brief pan to capture the action of the robbery. Another film from 1903, Wallace McCutcheon's A Search for Evidence, even uses point-of-view shots from the character's perspective cut into the action as a wife peers through hotel keyholes looking for her husband and his mistress. Rarely were these visual devices used in a systematic way from film to film, however, and they were almost never used in combination within a single film. They were, in most cases, momentary stylistic flourishes designed to capture the viewer's attention or to convey a particular story point without necessarily cohering into a concerted filmmaking approach. In fact, such flourishes often stand alongside other devices that seem to disrupt or confuse the narrative of the film. Numerous shorts of the period include repeated shots of the same action taken from different angles, as in A Trip to the Moon, where the film's spaceship lands on the moon twice, once when it comically crashes into the man in the moon, and a second time when it descends more realistically to the lunar surface. In a similarly confusing move, The Great Train Robbery includes a brief scene with no relationship to the film's narrative. Here, an outlaw simply points his pistol at the camera and fires. Who the character is shooting, or why, is never explained. He seems, in fact, to be shooting the audience itself. Exhibitors were told they could place the scene either at the beginning or the end of the film because its position within the narrative made no difference. These sorts of laissez-faire attitudes toward narrative clarity are indicative of a larger truth. Early cinema is best understood not in terms of its relationship to storytelling, so much as in its fascination with the appeal, surprise, and delight of film recording itself. This point was put forward by film scholars Tom Gunning and André Goudreau, whose introduction of the term cinema of attractions in the 1980s revolutionized the understanding of early motion pictures. For the cinema's first audiences, the main draw of motion pictures resided not in their ability to tell a story, so much as in their capacity to enable new ways of seeing the world. Above all else, what early cinema audiences and filmmakers valued was the sense of visual amazement that the new technology of film enabled. The idea that early cinema was premised on the property of attraction is intended to be quite literal. Most film exhibition during the cinema's first decade was transient or opportunistic, and showing films was largely the work of traveling showmen. Journeying from town to town, they set up projectors wherever they could, in tent shows, in churches and meeting halls, and as part of traveling fairs, carnivals, and other amusements. In cities, films were typically displayed at vaudeville theaters and music halls, played alongside the live comedy, music, and circus acts that were the theater's mainstay. Watching a film was intended to be an event and a thrill. Even a circus act might tell a story, but the appeal is not primarily narrative. It is the chance to be amazed by watching something you cannot see every day. In the case of early film, that something might well be the same world you could see around you already. Only this time, it was rendered suddenly novel by a camera that could record almost anything in existence, and play it back at the showman's command. Cinema's transitional age. Had the era of early cinema somehow been able to persist unchanged, it is possible that film would never have become the narrative form we know it as. The primary mandate of early cinema was not complex storytelling so much as sudden spectacle. The vaudeville sketch, the acrobatics act, the panorama painting, the boxing match, the religious pageant. These were the realms with which cinema was affiliated in its earliest years, far more so than narrative forms like literature or drama. Yet in many ways, the cinema succumbed to its own success. After years of existing as a traveling attraction, the medium witnessed a sea change as demand for motion pictures began to grow during the middle and later years of the 20th century's first decade. In response, filmmakers began to rely increasingly on the story film, viewing it as the surest means of creating new content expeditiously. Changes in demand began to foster changes in filmmaking style, and attraction gave way to narrative as the cinema's foremost imperative. Much of this change was precipitated by a revolution in the way that motion pictures were distributed. In cinema's earliest years, production companies tended to only sell their films to exhibitors, a practice that necessitated the period's traveling arrangements because showmen had to move from place to place, seeking out new audiences just to turn a profit on a single purchased film. That began to change in the first years of the 20th century with the emergence of a new middleman in the distribution chain. Film exchanges that purchased film reels from the producers and then rented them to exhibitors, allowing those exhibitors to turn a profit with a single, fixed audience. Instead of traveling in a perpetual search for new viewers, exhibitors could now set up stationary exhibition halls in major population centers and provide the same customers with new films on a semi-regular basis, cycling through films instead of cycling through audiences. Thus was born the Nickelodeon, named for the nickel admission prices that these makeshift theaters typically charged. Among filmmakers of the period, the so-called Nickelodeon boom that started around 1905 created an outright crisis of content as exhibitors demanded films at a rate they never had before. In 1907, the general manager of the Biograph Company declared that the studio was pushed to the limit of its capacity by the demand for new subjects. A new emphasis on storytelling presented the most effective solution. Scripting and filming stories under the controlled conditions of the film studio and its immediate environs provided an efficient way to manufacture the novelty that audiences demanded at the volume exhibitors now expected. But this in turn created new problems, a crisis of content of a very different sort. In the absence of dialogue and sound, how could filmmakers convey the kind of longer, more complex narratives that were needed? The broad storytelling style of early cinema no longer sufficed. In making The Great Train Robbery in 1903, it hardly mattered to director Edwin Porter or to his audiences who the robbers were or what their individual motivations might be. The sheer spectacle of the robbery itself and the thrill of watching it unfold constituted the primary pleasures of the film. But now such details of character and story mattered quite a lot, if only to differentiate the story of this train robbery from the one the studio would produce next week, as well as the dozens of similar films competing studios were making at the same time. For the first time, story had become an economic necessity for the cinema. It is this imperative, more than any other factor, that helps explain the worldwide shift in filmmaking styles during this time, sometimes referred to as a move toward a cinema of narrative integration. The period from around 1908 to the early 1910s was an era of tremendous experimentation as production companies competed against one another to create clear, compelling stories that would keep audiences coming back to see their latest films and exhibitors signing up to book their newest offerings. Pressed for ways to make narrative films more intelligible, filmmakers turned to the kinds of visual devices first tested during the era of early cinema, and now deployed not as visual flourishes, but as means of systematically directing audience attention and presenting narrative information. Hence the profusion of films using close-ups, where the camera frames an actor's face to better capture her expression, and cut-ins, where the camera focuses in detail on an object in the scene. Equally prevalent were all manner of camera movements, including pans, where the camera moves from side to side, and tracking shots, where the camera physically moves to follow a figure. This was also the era when intertitles, black and white cards containing narrative information, or lines of dialogue that were inserted into the film, began to proliferate, and when modern editing practices began to emerge. Yet, if the defining feature of the transitional period was a constant searching for new means of visual storytelling, the outcomes of these experiments were in no way consistent among the many filmmakers active during this time. In some cases, filmmakers managed to solve narrative problems with only limited use of camera and editing solutions, keeping the number of shots and edits to a minimum, while crafting a more deliberate arrangement of space and action within a mostly static frame. This is sometimes referred to as staging in depth, which became prevalent in many European countries. Its most notable practitioner in the United States was Charlie Chaplin, who started directing his own films early in his career, in 1914, focusing on a deliberate control of movement in the frame, over and above any reliance on camera work or editing. Other filmmakers chose to emphasize techniques of the camera as a solution to narrative impasse. This became a key component in the Vitagraph look that defined the films of the Vitagraph Company during the transitional years. In 1909, Vitagraph shortened the standard distance between camera and subject in its studio by instituting an official 9-foot line, changing the default shot distance from a long shot, encompassing the entirety of an actor's body, to a medium long shot, cut off at the ankles, or even a medium shot, cut off at the waist, thus bringing viewers significantly closer to the actors and the action. Filmmakers at the studio also endeavored to focus narrative attention by employing angles other than the straight-on, frontal views practiced by others at the time. This gave Vitagraph's pictures a remarkably natural look for the period, and Vitagraph actors were even permitted to turn their backs to the camera if it helped the staging of a scene. Ultimately, the most radical solution to the challenge of narrative, and by far the most influential, relied not on staging within the frame or adjusting shot distances, but on revolutionizing the film industry's approach to editing. This position is associated most closely with D.W. Griffith, who joined the Biograph Company in 1908. Though he was conservative in employing the kind of varied camera work with which others were experimenting at the time, he became committed early in his career to a liberal use of editing, which he viewed as the most effective means of enabling the kinds of multi-layered stories he wanted to tell. By his last year at Biograph, 1913, Griffith's films had more than twice as many shots as an average motion picture of that era. Many in the industry fretted about them being comprehensible to audiences, with one critic complaining that 3 times the proper number of scenes are...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?